And there we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. All four of you at the moment, but hopefully more coming soon. We're here to talk about what drives people to the political left. And we have with us here the Britisher, who's joined us from his usual position, either on Academic Agent Stream or the week that was.
Well, I'm just up here holding the cyber pass as usual.
As in your usual manner, we have Elisabeth, who is the treasurer for the US Liberalists, I believe, and also a welcome addition.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
We have Calum and Harry, who are from the UK Liberalists.
Greetings.
And I am not so obvious. Also, Mark from the UK Liberalists as well. So, for goodness sake, 1 second.
Smooth.
And we're back. Smooth, right? We're here to discuss this evening what drives people to the political left, and I will. This isn't unpopular opinions. Yes, I know it's not unpopular opinions. I will assert that basically the primary driver towards the left is compassion, and that people are driven to the left because the left has a very moral, uses the language of morality. It's not necessarily moral. In fact, we would argue it's probably quite immoral, but the language of morality naturally attracts those who have a compassionate outlook towards the left, and that's my assertion.
Do you want others to offer opposing views at this point?
Yeah, go for it.
I would like to say first off that obviously the political right and the political left are going to be different in America from what they are in the UK, but I believe that there are different factors that drive people to the political left. So if you look at, say, at people in the upper class who move to the left, they're going to be driven by different reasons than people in the lower class or people in the middle class. People in different positions, different walks of life will have different reasons. So while compassion is definitely a huge driver, especially in people with excess amounts of money who are looking down and seeing people lower than them not as well off, and they want to make things better. Yes, that's a bigger reason for them, but other people in other situations are not going to be driven by the same reasons.
I don't necessarily see. So the political class is typically the middle class and above, and the lower classes are more apolitical. And I think that the middle classes are mainly driven by compassion. And I think that there's also a case to be made that the lower classes are also driven by compassion for their fellow man, effectively, if they've got to a point where they are not as concerned about work and they can think about such things. I mean, you see that in terms of the way most of the working class that vote end up voting, a mix of different things dependent on the constituency they're in. But the left, I think, because it points out a group that is marginalized, that those who are in a position where they feel that they're comfortable get driven there. I mean, the left, I'm not making any bounds, is primarily composed of, champagne socialists and students who basically are well off but don't realize it yet.
Where do the unions fit into this?
See, unions to me today are. I worked in retail for a while and that sort of thing, and unions get pushed there. I mean, the only union I know of that really has sort of strong power in the UK today has to be the NUS, in terms of actually impacting the industry in which it's positioned. I mean, you really don't see most of the rhetoric that goes on in terms of unions, particularly in somewhere like retail, is surrounding the idea that they will say that they have fought for X amount of pay rise or whatever, and all of the employees say, well, no, they've allowed them to have that pay rise, but it's really no bounds to them. Like there's no victories, there's no great injustices being perpetrated against the working people that would sort of demand that union power increases.
Well, you see, the reason I sort of bring this up is because when I look at the left, I can understand how you see that certain certain aspects are driven by compassion. But I cannot see that as the main driver. I think that the left has always, historically been driven by fairness.
Right.
I know in some cases that can be much of a muchness as a difference between the two, and one can always disagree on what one sees as fair. And of course, the right and the left have, famously had arguments precisely about that. But I would say that it's fairness that seems to be the most the motivating factor mainly for the left. And they would basically see themselves as kind of the arbiters of justice, social justice in the traditional sense, as opposed to in what that term has been co-opted into these days.
Yeah, I would agree with Brisher on that. I think it's more the left and the people that that generally sit in that category see individuals very much in like the tabula rasa way, where everyone is a blank slate, and you can be you're basically the victim of your circumstances that are out of your control, and it's the primary function of society to correct for those people who are less fortunate through no fault of their own. And the degree to which that is done is the fairness that British is talking about. And then on top of that, you can then build, if you're on the left, your moral framework on how this is done and what's the best way of doing it. And, what is your hierarchy of oppressed individuals and how much should they receive? That's kind of the way I see it anyway. Anyone care to weigh in?
Well, I would have spoken, so I just thought I would kind of leave it there. But we do seem to have a rather pregnant pause here, don't we?
I think Mark's gone on mute. Okay, fine. I don't know. Well, I suppose everyone sees themselves as the moral and virtuous ones. But I guess the thing which has to be lacking is the notion that what you earn through your own work or your family's merit, that is not your inherent right, basically, and that has to be the difference.
Well, that kind of, because the left don't see the same thing that we do when we say earned, because they see all these extra societal, when they categorize things like white privilege, etc., and they believe that their acts are compassionate because they are redressing an unjust system rather, that really is oppressing people. But I think that there is definitely a place for things like resentment and hatred and that sort of thing. But when we say that you keep what you earn, well, they say, well, realistically, you haven't earned X amount of that, and that's why we're entitled to take it or redistribute it, or anything up to 100%, right? So they don't see you as having earned that; they see you as having unjustly benefited from your white privilege, which they believe to be a real thing. Well, and so when they take that away,
can I sort of just cut in to ask one thing? Because are we talking about the left in general, which of course would also include sort of old-fashioned leftists, or are we specifically talking about progressives? Because they are very much the ones who would kind of be talking about white privilege and things like that.
I think we should talk about the old-fashioned left as well, because that does make up, well, at least from what I understand, a higher proportion of people that would vote for Labour than the than the modern progressives. So it makes sense to cover their angle.
I don't think it actually makes a whole lot of difference what you talk about, because the old-fashioned left, they wouldn't use the same phraseology, but they still believe in class privilege, don't they?
But the Labour Party at the moment are in a clear divide over exactly this issue of the modern versus the old.
Put it like this: if you would find yourself some kind of, perhaps sort of a pensioner he's been Labour all his life, he's been working class, he's been a union member and whatever, and you asked him about the progressive stack, he would more than likely tell you where to get off. I do think there is a distinct difference between people who perhaps are socialists, for want of another word, or just, old-fashioned leftists, and people who have kind of wedded themselves to this concept of as I say, this social justice concept of the progressive stack, where somehow there is inbuilt into it some idea of white guilt and so on. I cannot see sort of older Labour supporters ever agreeing with something like that.
Would you define? No, go on, Elizabeth. Go on.
Even ignoring the progressive stack aspect of it, I think that pretty much anyone on the left would have a problem with people keeping what they earned if they don't feel that they deserved it. I think that on the right, you'll see people saying, oh, if you earn it, you deserve it. And on the left, they're saying, even if you earn it, you don't necessarily deserve it. So people who don't deserve it, they're going to say that was not legitimately earned. And yes, the modern progressives will say, okay, you don't deserve what you've earned because you came into it with white privilege. The older leftists would say, you don't deserve it because you acquired this by exploiting the poor, or
inheritance is the more common.
Yes, or inheritance. I was going to go there too. But I think that the idea of earned, they do mix it up with deserved. If they feel that you deserve what you have, then they'll say you earned it. If they feel you do not deserve it, then you didn't earn it. And who deserves what is based, yes, on whether you're a new leftist, an old leftist, a progressive, whatever else. But I think that the underlying concept is the same across all of them.
I think the left will also, like the older left, or the sort of, the social democrat type sort of sway, will also argue that that you have a responsibility, because they believe that the state is the arbiter of the people's will in a way that and that it should arbit all of the people's will, which is why they're sort of more of a favor of more social programs and that sort of thing, that you have a responsibility to have this redistribution happen. Like, if you've earned it, you've benefited from the society which you're in, and so a portion of that should be going back into the state, into the system, which is why those sorts of people are very frustrated with things like corporation tax and sort of high earners avoiding tax and using trusts to get around inheritance tax in that sense. But it's funny when you bring up something like pensions to these kinds of people as well, because they consider that to be a legitimate form of tax avoidance, but they see all these other methods, offshore storing and that sort of thing, is illegitimate, which I think is an interesting case. But I still think that when those kinds of people, the lighter left and the old left as well, are looking at things again from a compassionate stage, again with this deservingness, but also compassion, because they are in favor of larger government, but not, we're not talking crazy commie leftists or progressive stack leftists who really want to tear down the whole system because they see it as inherently corrupt, but the sort of the less left-leaning, who want to really they want more social programs, they want protection for the disabled, they want more educational resources for low-income areas and that sort of thing. I think they're still motivated by compassion in that sense.
The thing is, there's nothing in. Sorry, no, go on, Calum. I was already speaking quite a lot.
That's right. No, I was just going to say, what we've really spoken about there are the varying notions of fairness within the left, right? Like how there's a disagreement about what fairness societally actually is. And so I think that kind of undermines the Britishers' kind of proposal that the fairness is the thing that motivates the left more than any other political position. Because I think that every political position thinks it's motivated by fairness. They just disagree about what is fair.
I'm not sure. If you had a tick box, obviously this is, purely subjective, but if you had a tick box for people on the right wing, I think people's merit and people's accomplishments would appear higher on the list than things like fairness.
Yeah, but they would say, I think if you spoke to somebody on the right about meritocracy, they would say that somebody getting what they get through their merit is fair.
Of course, no, of course.
Yeah, can I just quickly cut in, because otherwise I'll forget what I just thought of. I agree that basically on the right, people would also see a lot of things through the lens of fairness. But I would put it like this, that as a motivation for the left, it would nonetheless still be there. So it doesn't mean that the left has to have a different motivation than the people on the right. So basically both sides can actually be arguing from the motivation of this is what a fairer society would look like. But nonetheless, the motivation in itself is still one of I want a fair society. Do you understand what I mean?
I do, yeah. I think what I would say to that is if they both share the same underlying motivation, then it's not specific enough to delineate between them. Do you think?
But it is, because the notion of fairness is entirely subjective. So fairness is to do with claiming a moral high ground, and both parties genuinely, and the same with religion, they genuinely believe they hold the moral high ground over one another. But the problem is there's no objective way to measure and clarify who holds the moral high ground unless you're measuring by something objective like, you know, GDP or some sort of other, you know, quantifiable social outcome. But again, to people on the left, those things are less relevant often because you're looking to equalize the playing field, not maximize the outcomes of some sort of metric.
Isn't it also the case that on the right, yes, fairness is a driver, but in some cases one is also just willing to shrug one's shoulders and just go, well, okay, some things are unfair.
Some and some, I think,
would actually come across on the left.
I think because the left leans towards collective and the right leans towards the self, typically, unless you fundamentally disagree with that, the idea being that the left don't trust people to make certain decisions for themselves. So when they say we need to solve this issue here, they're like, we need to make people contribute to this idea of my own morality. Because if you don't do it, then they won't do it themselves. Whereas the right would say something more along the lines of, here's a compassionate issue. What I will do is I will take on the personal responsibility of, you know, being successful myself, providing for those who are near to me, and then I will use the excesses of, you know, to give as I am able to try and solve X problem. And if everybody does that at the same time, then it will, you know, it will work. The difference is both sides get it wrong, of course, because if you take the right there or the self to its extreme, then you get sort of this idea that you know, everyone will provide everything for everyone, you know, eventually by, you know, pure market forces. That's where academic agent sits. And then on the left, you get this idea that no one can be trusted with anything, and therefore we need the super state and central planning to do everything for us.
So what you're saying is academic agent's top lobster.
I was saying academic agent wants to be the only lobster.
I mean, yeah, no, I completely agree. But obviously, the thing is that it doesn't make, the thing that I don't understand, and the thing that I guess I have real trouble understanding is, no doubt what we've said about, you know, fairness and that being at least, let's say minimum, a primary motivator, that's definitely up there. But surely once you're saying, you know, we know better than the majority of people and we have this stated goal, and now we're going to take your resources by force to achieve our goal, surely at this point, like, you must realize that to some extent you're like delineating from what is the moral path to walk down. This is where I'm really struggling.
This is one of the left's, I think it's just one of the left's more insidious assumptions, which is that because they have the moral high ground, have the right to force those who do not conform to their own morality to you know, to conform. And so it's like, oh, these people are so corrupt, they will never, you know, do this of their own volition. So what we will do is we will take their resources for them and redistribute them in a fairer, you know, more compassionate way. You know, you get that when you get sort of a CEO earns X million, and they go, well, no one should earn $1 million, right? That's their moral standpoint. No one should be on that much when there are still poor people. So we should take 90% of their wealth and redistribute it all over the place so that everyone could be the same, or certainly better. And you just think, once you start doing that, that's why the left eats each other so often, because as soon as one of them fails to meet the standards of their own virtue, or the morality changes slightly, it's like the left is very, very, lenient and, accepting and, wanting to promote, for instance, the LGBTQ community. And then, of course, you get trans exclusionary, radfems on the left who are like on the far left. And now they are being excluded and pushed out because their point of view was acceptable before, but now it's not. So they, they then get they destroy themselves in part by doing that.
Yeah, well, this is one of because in the liberalists, obviously, we have a principle that basically covers exactly this. So self-reliance, right? So people possess agency and should be treated as such, because treating people like victims becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is, from what I understand of like our principles anyway, and the left, that is one of the kind of largest hurdles that I see, where once you treat individuals as though they deserve your pity, and that you should pity them and give them what you can for the reason that they deserve to be pitied, then as it says here, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the people that are driven to the left, again, it's like, I don't see how you can't see that this is a danger at a minimum.
Well, sorry, go on.
One of the main problems, also the fact that the left, to a certain extent, understandably, looks at history and basically thinks, well, all the right ever does is oppose progress. And sooner or later they cave in anyway, and then the next disagreement arises further down the line regarding our next demand, and they cave into that, and then we move on again. So as far as they're concerned, the conservatives have been on the wrong side of history, for about a century or so.
That's
you also
probably...
have the...
No, go on.
But you also have the issue of conservatives tend to have a set moral standard that they will state, this is our moral standard. They have a moral foundation, if you will, or at least they claim to. And because they break it fairly often, they're labeled as hypocrites. The left claims not to have a moral standard. They say everybody should do whatever they want. Now, we know they actually do have a standard that they try to hold everyone to, but they will deny it. They'll say that they don't. So when you try to call them out as hypocrites, they'll just say, oh, well, that's just your opinion. That's just how you see it.
Good point, Matt.
I think it's indicative. I mean, it's interesting what you say about the right opposing progress, and in part that's to do with the fact that most of the right is very traditionalist. I think a part of why people who get taken towards the left and the left specifically target don't see, the dissonance of their own thinking, of the left's thinking rather, or most of it, is because the left tends to target the young. In particular, this is why you see them going for the student vote, or they go for a demographic, shall we say, that they will sell the victim narrative to. In a way, it's either the working class or it's the a minority in society.
Yeah, a group that will effectively become beholden to them.
Yes, and a group that they can convince as well that are powerless because of a systemic injustice, whatever that systemic injustice is, how nutty it is, on a scale from. No, go on.
Or in the case of the young, the students, if you will, people who believe that they can themselves go out and change the world and are looking for a way to do that. And the left appeals to that and says, come with us, we're going to change the world.
Yeah, and they have a very simplistic view. Like, it's very easy to swallow. If you haven't been educated to think very deeply about things, it's very easy to swallow what the left is saying on a standard. On a very basic, surface level compassion as well. They'll say, here are these marginalized groups. You want to change society, we can give you that. that power through this one thing that, you know, is controlling everything, patriarchy, or you know, sort of all these systemic forces, where be it the rich, be it, you know, men or whatever, and all we need to do is tear down this institution, and that'll be that. And then you have one of the greatest catalysts that can be given to mankind, which is adversity, because everybody wants something to rally against, because if you don't, you become complacent. And so whereas the people on the right who will focus inwardly, people on the left will tend to focus outwardly much more, certainly from the beginning, because they don't really want to look inwards, because it's a lot more work, I think, at the beginning to get yourself in order than it is to look at these bigger problems and then oversimplify those problems to the point where you think that you can handle it. And even if you think it's too complicated, then you figure that the resources of something like the state will help you achieve that much better. And it becomes more important to get that resource first, because that's quite easy to do in terms of the method by which you do it. You know, you win seats and you try and gain power in parliament, and you try and vote with you know, that way as well, and you try and convince people around you to vote that way. That's really not difficult to try and do. And then anyone who opposes you in that rather simplistic thing becomes, you know, beyond saving. I think that's one of the things that the left constantly, it will dehumanize its opponents a lot more.
I am going to give some credit here. So to the idea of leftist thinking and progress, though. So this is something which you guys, you know, you've both talked about briefly before. So you said that, and I quite like this, the idea that, you know, the right is always the one holding and barring back, and the left are the pushers of boundaries. And this is obviously true, because you have people that are predominantly left wing, when you see the studies, that have higher degrees of traits of openness and creativity. And you have the right as kind of, you know, the barrier in, if you want to call it that, and stifling progress. And again, to push to what Elisabeth said, where, you know, the left are the ones who are more open in this way and more subjective, and they are willing to take more than what is deemed currently acceptable and change and look for new ideas, which has led, whether you like it or not, to some forms of societal progress. Obviously, the argument is, you know, has it gone too far? That's fine. But the way I see it is like you have a balance between the two, where the left are essentially the child, where they say, you know, they have a young and open view of the world. And, you know, they say, as a child does, life's not fair, you know, life's not fair. And you have the parent who's stuck in their ways, has seen the world as it is, and says, you know, well, you know, yeah, life is not fair. That's the way it is. You have to earn your way in the world. And it's like this constant back and forth balance. So it might not just be a simple moral thing, but it's also sort of a totalitarian, like a worldview, rather than just a simple moral dilemma.
You know that you've just put an image into my mind of the left as the crying child throwing a fit with its little red rosette on its jacket because it's seen a toy in the shop that it wants, and the right with the blue rosette on its jacket is the grown-up saying, no, you can't have that.
You have to earn it. I mean, is that not somewhat accurate?
Yeah, my the image that I always conjure up of a average leftist is that it's like comedy sketch with that kid who just goes, "Fuck you, mom," when she tells him he can't have the cereal. It's exactly that, I think.
But what about, okay, so we are going to, obviously, we are all being harsh here. I'm going to play the devil's advocate in this discussion, I guess. So for the left, though, obviously you do have groups who have to acquire resources in one manner or another. And if you are, for whatever reason, let's say you're less able in terms of your intelligence, or you're less able for physical reasons, or, you know, even mental health reasons, then can you not see the left's compassion towards these people, where it's like, well, you know, we're not going to get the resources that we require voluntarily to support these people and to support the progress we need. So, you know, what other choice do we have if we're not to descend into chaos?
Yeah, they would argue that most people, being inherently selfish, will not give to these things. Despite the statistics, they're not big fans of charity. They want a way that they feel that they can contribute, i.e., the state, taxation, whatever, but without taking on the responsibility that would be, for instance, setting up a charity themselves. It's much easier to feel good about yourself doing this if you throw money at something which says it's going to do it.
I think on that aspect has also got something to do with dignity. That basically the recipients of those funds would then not be effectively at the mercy of people giving them alms for the poor, so to speak, but would effectively have an entitlement.
Yeah, this is one of the things that really annoys me about their position. Actually, is so. I mean, I guess the most cogent, the most relevant example would be food banks in the UK, right? So for them, like you see in the media all the time, the left representing food banks as this terrible thing. Like, why do we have food banks in 2018? But they're absolutely fine with the government taking people's money and just redistributing it, even though it's basically exactly the same thing, except when it's a food bank, it's somebody in your local community giving you resources because they want to and they want to help.
Oh, but I don't think the left hate food banks because they exist. They hate them because they have to exist. It's like,
no, I totally disagree. I think they think it's like they think it's demeaning. Why would they hate people redistributing wealth in that manner, but they don't hate the government redistributing wealth?
No, because they see it as a necessary, like not even a necessary evil. Just I think, from what I understand anyway, it's they hate the fact that people have to go to food banks and, you know, sacrifice their dignity because they have so little. And
Yeah.
it's why is this happening when there is such an excess of resources? That would be their argument.
I disagree with you there. You see in America, at least, you see people on the left trying to outlaw local charities. There was a woman who was arrested because she would make lunches for the kids in her neighborhood. She lived in a very poor neighborhood, and she would just make huge lunches, and the kids could just come over to her yard, and she would just give out sandwiches. And the local government stepped in and said, you're not allowed to do that because you don't have a license as a food preparation facility. And she said, I'm not a food preparation facility. I'm handing out lunches to kids who come and eat here. She refused to stop, and so they arrested her. You have another in my own state. You have a church that would do that.
But isn't that, sorry, obviously that is completely ridiculous, of course, but again, isn't that's less to do with a moral critique from the left and more to do with an overarching bureaucracy where it's like, do you have a permit for that, governor? Like, I mean, isn't that kind of
I think that underlies it, does it not?
Yes, I think it is an underlying idea of we don't want anyone but the government to be caring for the poor.
Yeah, they look at problems within society to be so insurmountable by individual action that there must be something big that deals with it. But they decide that if they haven't voted in the people who are going to deal with this insurmountable problem, then it's going to be even more corrupt system or a worse system than what would be produced privately. I mean, that's why they want to have a modicum of control, so that if everything did go tits up, that they would then be able to try and deal with it. I mean, they fail to see that in giving so much power to the government, and of course the inherent problems in the slowness of government and how little it changes over time, that what they're doing is shooting their own cause in the foot.
And I think for them as well, there's something comforting about the sort of anonymous facelessness of a government institution just plopping money in your bank account every month, because it's not like somebody's holding you accountable. And if you're going around to your neighbor every week to get a free dinner, say somebody in your neighborhood is like cooking for the poor people in the area, then you have to be like, oh yeah, I have to justify the fact that I keep coming here for free food. Whereas just like the anonymity of it.
But councils do spend money on food banks. So again, what I don't understand is why obviously it's illogical, like most things on the left. So I am struggling to put this into words. But why would you, when the government are putting money into food banks, and when you have individuals that are giving to these food banks, what you're saying is because people have to go in person and dehumanize themselves, is that what the left are opposed to, not the act of giving itself?
I guess that is what I'm saying they think. I think it's absurd to say that that's dehumanizing somebody. I think it's a very human thing to accept charity from somebody in your neighborhood.
But they would argue that it's the inequality that is the problem. I mean, this is one of the fundamental things which we disagree on. They say we say poverty is the issue. They would say inequality is the issue in terms of that, and that's one of the big places where the left and the right divide, because in the right's perspective, it doesn't matter if someone's earning £1 billion, provided that the majority of society, there's not this so much inequality that that the poverty rate is really low, whereas the left would say the fact that there is inequality proves that there's corruption in society, and if there's corruption in society, we want to get rid of that, because if you're it will lead to even more oppression over time. And they will cite things like crime statistics, which is typical of areas where inequality is very low, but the wages are very low, and poverty can be quite high in those areas. The crime is relatively low because people don't get they don't see that they have a little and someone else has got a lot more, and that they want a piece of that, and then they'll go and try and take it, and theft and that sort of thing. I mean, we're seeing that in South Africa right now, where they're using the excuse of race, but they're saying, these people have more, we have a lot less, and we want to do it. So even in areas of relative affluence, where there are no one's in poverty, but the divide between the richer and the poorer can be quite substantial. The poor, there's still quite a high crime rate because people look at their neighbours and they get jealous, effectively.
I wouldn't put the South African problem down to economics.
Oh, not just petty jealousy. No. That is far more complicated than that, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think
back to everything you just said there is going back to what Britisher said from the start. It's an idea of fairness, and it's two different views of what fairness is. Is it equality or is it equity?
I think it's an interesting problem when you compare, like, there are definitely two streams of the left as well, because there are the people on the left who live in relative, or they live in the position of the downtrodden, or they feel they're oppressed. So you get the sort of people who've been who have been historically oppressed, like take the homosexual community and that sort of thing. And then you also have sort of people who are aware that there are problems. I think it's because they see that they have it well off. They have sort of an imposter syndrome because they don't feel that they've legitimately earned it, or they get told that they haven't legitimately earned it, and that they then want the problem to go away, but they're too comfortable to deal with the problem themselves, so the state has to do it for them, or it's too big for them to solve themselves, so they do it, but they detach themselves. There's the argument of hypocrisy from the why don't you take in a migrant family then, that sort of side of things that doesn't get addressed, I suppose, because they don't really want to touch the problems of society, and so they say, well, if we hand over this problem to the state, then it's out of our hands, but we've done our part. Does that make sense?
Yeah, isn't in a way what you describe should we say sort of the gentrification of the left? Isn't that also in a way part of the part and parcel of the rise of progressivism, so to speak? That these issues, white guilt and so on, the progressive stack, started to rise in a way the more people were effectively part of the left who weren't really part of the traditional working class anymore.
A part of it, I think, is sorry, can you say that again?
Well, isn't part of the problem the fact that you've now effectively got more and more middle class, the ones you refer to as the champagne socialists. Now, they are not part of the working class. They therefore don't see, the issue as kind of one of class struggle or something like that. It's no longer the working class wanting fairer distribution of the wealth of the country, and therefore one more and more goes into this issue of the progressive stack of social justice. That effectively it's become almost a sign of the gentrification of the whole place, that one is now addressing completely different problems and no longer is actually catering for the working class of the country, so to speak.
No, there's definitely been the fragmentation into what does and what doesn't constitute sort of the marginalized group, because the 20th century proved that just focusing on the working class didn't work, particularly with the fact that the worldwide workers' revolution didn't happen.
Well, I mean, I think it did work as far as politics were concerned. But I think two things happened in that regard. For one, the West continued to get wealthier and wealthier. So now it's even people who would deem themselves working class, public, plumbers and electricians and whatever, can actually live quite a middle class lifestyle.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't really see a house without Sky Television anymore. Whereas definitely when I was young and a child, when everyone had, it was very rare. There was that one child in the class who had Sky Television, and everyone would try and get over to their house.
But I mean, aside from that, there was also the problem, early 1990s, where effectively, the Soviet bloc collapsed. So that is when pretty much the left, as a political institution, started looking for some sort of other message they could sell, because it's very difficult to try and sell people the workers' nirvana if those countries who had tried it had basically run themselves into the ground. Yes.
Although, interestingly, we are seeing a resurgence of that thinking, because we're now almost a generation down the line.
Yes, it's slipping. It's slipping from living memory of the next generation, the young people coming up. So perhaps Venezuela is doing us a favor
here. Perhaps. I mean, it's certainly interesting. Although Venezuela as an option is being touted as the US reducing the price of oil and that sort of thing, or the worldwide reduction in the price of oil being responsible for the crashing of that economy, or the death of Chavez and Nicolas Maduro being, not morally righteous enough. You also see that sort of argument. I don't think it's necessarily as strong an argument as the entire collapse.
In that case, I mean, if it is really Nicolas Maduro, if that is the problem, then I have a very simple, very, very simple solution. They can have Jeremy Corbyn.
We'll send him. We'll gift wrap him.
Yeah, precisely.
He will bring real socialism to
the United Kingdom.
Well, if he's able to live as well over there as their leaders are currently able to live, he might not have an objection to it.
I believe I saw a video that came out. I think The Guardian actually even highlighted this, that Maduro sat in at a press conference and halted the questions halfway through so that he could eat a sandwich on camera.
Jesus Christ.
And you just think, how disconnected is he from his own populace to not realize that is probably a bad move, or unless he's so confident of his the military junta that he has effectively controlling the place at the moment, because he won a massive landslide, of course. Victory.
Don't they all?
If that was the video I saw, then I don't think that was how it happened. It was that he did start eating while he was being asked questions, but the explanation I heard was that it was it was an event that went on for hours and hours, and that's why he was eating. And people were saying it was wrong for him to be eating on camera when people were starving. But the fact was, it was going for a long time. So I see both sides kind of have a point.
Yes. No.
Well, actually, it reminds me a bit of what was he called? Ceausescu, wasn't it? The dictator of Romania under under communist rule. Because as we all know, the harvests in the East basically were terrible, and they were only really getting worse over the years due to complete mismanagement. But Ceausescu would once in a while he would appear sort of in cinema broadcasts, like little advertisements before the film and whatever, and there he would be, going to witness the harvest, and you would just have fruit, piled high in front of him, glistening apples and tomatoes and gherkins and what. Just, it was a huge pyramid of the stuff.
Yes.
It was all fake. It was all made of wax and stuff like that, because this stuff just wasn't available in any quantity.
Amazing.
But what was so beautiful is that the population couldn't know that. So as far as they were concerned, here was he parading around in front of all the potatoes and gherkins and whatever, whereas they were still queuing for hours
to try and get
any food. So there was really that sort of there was that side to it of, oh, look, all the food we've got. Oh, just a shame that you can't have it.
Indeed. Just to bring it back round to the initial question, because I want to finish in about 10 minutes. The idea of the reason that this question came up was because definitely in my early political days, I was very much a lefty, mainly because of my my A-level sociology teacher, who was a very flamboyantly gay man who was very keen on things like the idea of fluidity of identity and that sort of thing.
This explains so much about you, Mark.
Oh, obviously. But I just brings it on because the way it was sold to me, because I get this thing that comes up constantly from people on the right, and you see that in the liberalists as well sometimes, is you get this idea that the left are jealous of the achievements of the rich, or the successful, or capitalists in general, and that they'll do it. But I really don't see that in the motivation that is given to people to join the left, because I know that certainly I joined out of a desire that I saw. I mean, they will definitely demonize things like conservatives. I remember violently people being quite violently angry about when austerity was first being introduced, and about 3 or 4 months down the line, when the first set of tax breaks came in for people earning over 80,000 or whatever it was, and they're going, my mum, who's on disability benefit or whatever, has had her payments slashed, or I'm trying to find work and I can't afford to live in the flat that I'm living in whilst I try and find work because of this austerity measure. And then what's happened is that has been counterbalanced entirely by the savings made by the government in that have been entirely counterbalanced by this tax cut that they've given to themselves, which is quite, as much as they demonize it, it's more like they'll point at those who are marginalized in society by this whatever policy, even if they had it better than they should have, according to the right. Then you get the bloating of the welfare system or whatever, and you say, well, now it's at an appropriate level. But they will say that, because they've lost out on this, and why would you allow that? Those people shouldn't be in power because they are abusing their position to benefit themselves, to pay for their third house or whatever. And they don't have the interests of people at heart.
Yeah, I don't really see that as a left-right issue at this point in our politics. I think that's true of the majority of politicians.
I mean, kind of, but the left in particular will use that because they're very good at pointing out the flaws of the current system. a little way down the line, I suppose. It's more apparent on both sides now that, I mean, as you say, Calum, there's more of a progressive consensus between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. But you take something like when David Cameron first came into power, and he was a proponent of the big society, small government, big society, and that sort of thing. And it was entirely insincere, and just driving a massive disillusionment with politics. And because it's a disillusionment with the current system, of course, you'll have people on the left who say, well, there is this other system, it's called socialism, it's called communism, that will that can, if we tear down the existing corrupt system, we can replace it with this morally fortuitous system that will, blanket everything in the glory of leftist politics.
Yeah, I think what you're describing there is mostly strategy, because it's easy to sell religion to people who feel like they've lost everything. And that's basically what the left are doing at this point, is you're saying the system's not working for you, try this system, won't it be great? And most people are sufficiently poorly educated about the history of socialism that they might actually go for it.
Well, I think one thing, regarding the jealousy, I think the reason the right tends to misunderstand that aspect is because they see the left using the wealth of, the rich as a comparative instrument when they're talking about the inequality in society. So I think that's where the leap comes on the right of saying, oh, well, it's all about jealousy. I agree with you there. I don't really think that's the case. I had a second point, but I've completely forgotten what that is.
Strong effort. Well, I think on that note, then I think we're going to end, because it's just coming up to 9 o'clock now. But it's been a pleasure having you all on.
It's been a pleasure being here.
Yes.
And
so did we come to a conclusion about what motivates the left?
I don't really think so, to be honest. I think
we all have different ideas about it.
This is something. I mean, the idea is that there, as Elisabeth has said, that it's a multiplicity of reasons. But I think I still maintain that even if the stratagem of the left, isn't born of compassion, I think that the people that are drawn in are the compassionate initially, and then they are re-educated to be, to begin to hate that which is in the way of their compassionate purpose, and then it's a more of a slippery slope in my opinion.
Well, if I can recall correctly, there even is a Yes Minister episode called "The Compassionate Society."
Ooh.
Which is definitely worth watching, because it has got one or two sort of really truly surreal moments in there, which I cannot recommend highly enough. I really must say it's always worth watching Yes Minister, no matter which episode you watch.
It is truly a phenomenal series. And on that note, I think it's time to end. But thank you very much for watching, viewers, and thank you very much to my guests for being here. Until next time. When's the next stream? We don't have plans for next stream yet, but I'm sure something will come up. I'm working on a new video at the moment, which will hopefully be out in the next week or so. Thank you very much.
See you, Ben.
See ya.